Hi, everybody. It's Miss Stacy back with the next chapter of our Hudson Taylor book. Chapter 3 is called One Single Word. Now that Hudson was a believer, he couldn't wait for Sundays at the Methodist Chapel on Penfold Hill. Bible reading was no longer boring. Every time the Bible was read now, words jumped out at him, and what had once been dull, dry sermons were filled with new meaning. And while he knew he was too young to lead the church Bible class or any other church activity for that matter, he also knew that somewhere there was something he could do for God. Finally, one day, he and Amelia had an idea. They decided to skip the Sunday evening service, which they loved, and instead spend the time visiting homes in the poorest areas of Barnsley. As they went, they would hand out tracts, invite people to church, and tell them about God's love and concern for them. Amelia and Hudson grew very close during this time as they planned and prayed together for their Sunday visits. They felt happy, and neither of them could see any reason why their visiting could not continue indefinitely. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, however, had other plans. Amelia was now 14 years old, and her parents had been looking for a good school for her to attend. After much searching, they decided to send their daughter to the boarding school run by Aunt Hudson, Mrs. Taylor's sister, at Barton upon Humber, 45 miles away. Amelia would be able to come back and visit during vacations, and she would be in good hands with her aunt. Meanwhile, Aunt Hudson had also been wondering what to do with her son John. He was finished with school and needed a job, so it was decided that in return for Amelia's attending school in Barton upon Humber, John would come and live with the Taylor family and be an apprentice pharmacist to Mr. Taylor. It was to be a straight swap of children and would not cost either family a penny, except for the train fare home at vacation time. It all seemed to work out perfectly except for a few minor details. Hudson lost his best friend and prayer partner, and in exchange got a constant companion who reminded him of the junior clerks at the bank. John never seemed to take anything seriously, especially Hudson's need for privacy. Amelia and Louisa had always shared a bedroom, while Hudson had his own. Now things were different. Hudson's personal belongings had been moved aside, and a second bed moved into the room. And if that weren't enough, John talked endlessly about things that did not interest Hudson. He would even interrupt Hudson while he was praying or reading his Bible to tell him a joke. It was a very difficult time, and despite the presence of John in his bedroom, Hudson felt lonely. To him, John seemed an unfair exchange for Amelia. Through it all, Hudson continued to pray and read his Bible. It was during this time that he heard God speak the one word that would be the focal point of every decision he would make for the rest of his life. One single word: China. One day, Hudson was praying and telling God how his life seemed so unfocused and frustrating. He had tried to do the right thing, but it was so difficult to live a godly life, especially with John breathing down his neck all the time. Finally, in desperation, Hudson told God that if he would break the power of sin in his life, he would do anything God asked him to do, go anywhere God asked him to go, and speak to anyone God asked him to speak to. As Hudson prayed his prayer out loud, great peace came over him. Later he wrote about it. Never shall I forget the feeling that came over me then. Words can never describe it. I felt I was in the presence of God. Something seemed to say, "Your prayer is answered. Your conditions are accepted." And from that time, the conviction never left me that I was called to China. In the same way that his father's magnifying glass focused sunlight into a narrow band of powerful light, so Hudson's life began to focus on China. Every decision and every activity became valuable only if it moved him towards his goal. This focus on China took several forms. First, he realized he would need all the academic training he could get. He had been taught at home most of his life because he wasn't always strong enough to attend school, so he was used to setting his own course of study. In a letter to Amelia, he explained why he had begun getting up at 5 a.m. to study. "I must study if I mean to go to China. I am fully decided to go, and am making every preparation I can. I intend to rub up on, improve my Latin, to learn Greek and the rudiments of Hebrew, and to get as much general information as possible." Second, he needed to toughen up his body. His mother had always fussed over him because he was so often sick. She made sure he sat where there was no draught, ate wholesome food, and was careful to wrap up warm on cold winter days when he went out to deliver medicines. All of this fussing made Hudson whether he would ever survive in China, not to mention the dangerous sea voyage to get there. There was nothing else for it but to toughen up. He started with a strenuous exercise program outside in the cold. His mother found it difficult to look out in the window and see him working so hard on frosty mornings. She worried that he would catch pneumonia. Hudson also got rid of his feather bed and began sleeping on bare boards. He gave away many things that were not essential to his daily life. When I get to China, he told himself, my body must be ready. Third, Hudson had to find some way to learn the Chinese language. Of course, he didn't know anyone who had been to China, much less spoke Chinese, so there was no way he could learn how the language sounded. He could learn what it looked like written down. It so happened that someone had given him a copy of the Gospel of Luke in Chinese. There was just one catch. There was no translation or dictionary to go with it. The chapter and verse numbers were in English as well as Chinese, however. Hudson managed to persuade John to help him, and together they set about unraveling the puzzle of the Chinese language. The traditional Chinese language is written in pictographic form. It means that a picture represents an idea. A picture of the sun and moon together is translated as the word bright. In English, of course, we use letters to stand for the actual sounds we make. This means English is a phonetically written language. Even though there were many languages and dialects spoken in China, everyone was able to look at the picture of the sun and the moon and know it meant bright, no matter how the word was actually said. This made learning to write Chinese a very valuable skill. This is how Hudson and John worked out what the pictograms meant. They would pick a word in English and then find it in a verse in an English copy of the Gospel of Luke. If they were looking at the word salvation, they might identify Luke chapter 2, verse 30. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation. They would use an English concordance to find 10 or 12 other verses in Luke that had the word salvation in them, such as Luke chapter 3, verse 6, all flesh shall see the salvation of God, and Luke chapter 19, verse 19. Today, salvation has come to this house. Then came the tricky part. They would then find the same verses in the Chinese Gospel of Luke and write them out one under the other. And they searched for the pictogram that appeared in all the Chinese verses. Finally, they searched the entire Gospel in Chinese, looking for more verses with the same pictogram in them. If in every instance they found the pictograph to be where the English word could be found, they would enter it into a notebook in pencil. Later, if they did not find a single place where that pictogram seemed to mean something else, they would trace the pictogram in ink. Slowly, one word at a time, they identified and memorized the Chinese characters until Hudson could read and write over 500 of them. Not only did Hudson need to know the Chinese language, but he also realized that he needed to know more about China itself, particularly beyond the coastal areas. In 1850, it was not easy to find out much about China. The Chinese people were very good at keeping secrets, since they did not want foreigners or white barbarians, as they called them, to influence their way of life. This was partly because of the Opium War, in which the English humiliated the Chinese people. The Chinese were not about to forgive the English for that humiliation. The Opium War had begun in 1839 when Hudson was 7 years old. It was fought over trade rights between England and China. English people wanted many things that the Chinese had to sell: silk, spices, tea, and porcelain china, to name a few. The Chinese, though, didn't want anything the English had to sell except for a little silver. This led to a huge trade imbalance. The English soon owed the Chinese lots of money, and they were frustrated that the Chinese didn't want to buy things from them to even out how much they owed. So they set about trying to come up with something the Chinese did want. Unfortunately, some English officials came up with a very clever but a very horrible plan. They would sell the Chinese people a drug called opium, a drug that was very addictive, so they would need to buy more and more of it. Opium came from special poppies that grew in India, a country the British had already overrun and made part of their empire. Before the Chinese government knew what was happening, 40,000 cases of the drug were being brought into China each year, causing thousands and thousands of Chinese people to become addicted to opium. It was a nightmare for the Chinese people. People lay in the streets begging for opium. High officials became addicted and made foolish decisions, and even the emperor's own son died from an overdose of the drug. No matter how much it angered the British, the emperor decided they had to be stopped. He declared a ban on the import of opium. English, of course, were not ready to give up their new trading item, and so war began. It was a war that didn't take the English long to win. Even though China had invented powder many centuries before, it was the British who knew how to use it in cannons and guns. The Chinese were hopelessly outgunned by their invaders and were defeated in 1842. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking. It was a very unequal treaty, but then the British had won and the Chinese had lost. As one condition for ending the bombardment of China, the emperor had to agree to give the island of Hong Kong to the British and to open up 5 cities along the coast as places for foreigners to live and trade. The treaty said nothing about opium imports. The Chinese had lost the real battle they had set out to win, the right to keep opium out of their country. The Chinese were very bitter about this foreign interference, and while they tolerated traders and a few missionaries in the treaty ports, as they were called, they would not let missionaries or any foreign barbarians into the inland areas. This was still the basic state of affairs between the two countries when Hudson began to focus attention on China. Hudson knew the Chinese would not welcome him or the message he brought, yet the tracts he got from the Chinese Evangelization Society in London inspired him. There was such an enormous number of people in China who had never heard about Jesus Christ. Hudson read and reread the tracts, trying to grasp the numbers of people they talked about. He studied the map until he worked out that Great Britain would fit into China about 40 times. One tract estimated that number of people in China to be about 400 million. It seemed almost too big a number to be true. About this time, Hudson heard that the local congregational minister had a good book on China called China, Its State and Prospects by Walter Medhurst. He knew that Medhurst had printed copies of the Bible in Chinese and disguised himself as a native in order to smuggle them up the rivers into inland China. Hudson could hardly wait to read the book and learn about Medhurst's adventures. "May I borrow your copy of Walter Medhurst's book?" Hudson politely asked the congregational ministry. "Certainly," said the minister, "but I am curious as to what a pharmacist's son wants with such a book." "I intend to be a missionary to China, sir," Hudson replied. "I need to find out as much about the place as I possibly can, and this book has been recommended to me." "And how are you going to pay for your trip and support yourself once you get to China?" the minister inquired. "Like the disciples in the New Testament who took nothing when Jesus sent them to minister to people, I too will trust God to supply all my needs," Hudson said confidently. The minister smiled. "I have some advice for you, young man," he said in a kind voice, putting his hand on Hudson's shoulder. "As you grow older, you will become wiser. You will see that such an idea was fine in the days when Christ himself was on earth, but not now." Hudson was surprised to hear words like this from a man of God, but he was not discouraged. Medhurst's book was too exciting. It described rice paddy-covered plains, walled cities, enormous mountain ranges, yak trips, and river voyages. Hudson read it from cover to cover several times, and he took some advice not from the congregational minister, but from the book itself. Medhurst strongly urged potential missionaries to get medical training before they arrived in China. Something clicked in Hudson when he read this. Now he had another focus in his training for China. Yes, he would go to China with medical training. Of course, the question was, how do you get such training? Before he could find an answer to the question, it was time for Amelia to come home for the summer vacation. 18-year-old Hudson couldn't wait to share his new direction with his sister. When Amelia arrived home, she did not come alone. She brought with her the school's music teacher, Mary Ann Vaughn. Mary Ann was lively and funny, pretty and talented. She played the piano and sang for them. Hudson was hooked. He couldn't believe how perfect she was. He reasoned that God had brought Mary Ann into his life so he would have a wife to go with him to China. It all fit so perfectly. Imagine them as a team, the first missionaries ever to set foot in a far-off Chinese village. He would preach and give medical advice while Mary Ann taught the children, led singing. The 3 of them spent a wonderful summer together, horseback riding, singing, and laughing. By the time Mary Ann and Amelia boarded the train for Barton upon Humber and the boarding school, Hudson felt sure he had spent the most wonderful summer of his life with his future wife. After they had gone, he still had to work out how to get medical training. The obvious place was to go to London. It was so expensive to live there. He would have to work full-time just to pay for his food, accommodations, and school fees, leaving him no time to actually attend medical school. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to come up with a solution that worked. Fortunately for him, His mother's older sister, Aunt Hannah, who lived in Hull, came up with an idea. Her brother-in-law, Robert Hardy, was a well-respected doctor in Hull, and he was looking for an assistant. In exchange for room and board and a small wage, as well as access to the classes Dr. Hardy taught at a local medical school, would Hudson be willing to become the doctor's assistant? It was a question Hudson didn't need to be asked more than once. On his 19th birthday, he boarded a train headed for Hull, 50 miles away, and in doing so, took another step closer to China. Well, tomorrow we're going to learn more about Hudson's time as a medical assistant. See you later.